Putin is under immense pressure from the bottom up by the hundreds of thousands, probably millions of Russians who are now facing the threat of mobilization and don't want to go and be chucked into the meat grinder of Ukraine, and from the top down, from amongst the elite, who amongst the kind of pro-war elite, who sense that this is not going well and are casting around for someone to blame. Now they're talking about the defense minister. There's only one step further than that, and that's to start criticizing Putin himself.
But first, Putin may be celebrating his 70th birthday today, but does he actually have much to celebrate? Writing in today's Times, Mark Bennett has the headline, Putin at 70, isolated, irrational and fearing for his health. There seems, Mark writes, little for the president to celebrate as Russian elites dare to ask, is he losing control? Well, joining me now is the former BBC correspondent and Russia watcher, Gabriel Gatehouse. Thanks so much for joining, Gabriel.
Hi, Hannah. Good to be with you.
I just wonder how accurate you think that assessment, that analysis from Marx is. I mean, he goes on to say there was a time when Vladimir Putin would have celebrated his birthday by heading into the Siberian wilderness with an old comrade for a spot of fishing, but he won't have such an exciting day today. Do you think there's something in this sense that he's isolated and that people who once gathered round him might have celebrated are starting to question things even openly?
For sure. I mean, no one is openly criticizing Putin just yet in the Russian media, but talking about him going on a fishing trip with one of his mates on his birthday. One of those mates would be Sergei Shoigu, the defense minister. They've been photographed on chummy fishing trips and hunting out in the taiga or in the forests and the woods in Russia. Sergei Shoigu is one of Putin's closest allies, and of course is in charge of this war in Ukraine. Yesterday, on Russian state-controlled TV, so on the TV that is controlled by the Kremlin, the deputy head of the Russian-controlled Kherson administration, this is the bit of one of the bits of Ukraine that Russia annexed just a few days ago, said that the noble thing for Mr. Shoigu to do at this point would be to shoot himself. Now, that kind of criticism is absolutely unheard of hitherto on Russian state TV. What does this tell you? It tells you that Putin is under immense pressure from the bottom up by the hundreds of thousands, probably millions of Russians who are now facing the threat of mobilization and don't want to go and be chucked into the meat grinder of Ukraine. And from the top down, from amongst the elite, who amongst the kind of pro-war elite, who sense that this is not going well and are casting around for someone to blame. Now they're talking about the defense minister. There's only one step further than that, and that's to start criticizing Putin himself.
But that is a step they haven't taken. So, I mean, how does that happen? Is there a way that can happen? Because people speak of, well, we all know the repercussions for anyone who dares to question Putin himself.
Right. And Putin's approach has always been, just like most previous Russian leaders before him, he is sort of seen as this noble, untouchable Tsar, one who cannot be criticized. Anything that goes wrong is blamed on underlings who are corrupt or not good at their jobs and can then be fired and dispensed with. And certainly this has been a very strong tendency in Russian politics, Soviet politics, Tsarist politics, going all the way back for centuries. I think the problem here now is that Putin has identified himself so strongly with this war in Ukraine. He has to be able to show some kind of victory here, because a defeat would be a sign of weakness, and his rule basically depends on strength. The idea that he has a democratic mandate, I think, even in Russia, doesn't really wash. Everyone knows that his power, his respect, stems from this vision of strength and this vision of competence. And at the moment, those two things are really being challenged. Now, I'm not saying that the end game is in sight. I'm not saying that people are necessarily maneuvering for some kind of a palace coup, although we have heard people like Ramzan Kadyrov, the leader of Chechnya, usually a staunch ally, criticizing the conduct of the war. People like Prigozhin, the man who's known as Putin's chef, an old ally and crony of his who set up the Wagner mercenary group, also criticizing the war. I'm not saying these people are directly challenging Putin, but they're nibbling around at the edges of the greater Kremlin, if you like. And this is very dangerous for Russian stability, for the Putin regime.
When you say, he depends on this image as a strong man, where do you think that leads when, as you say, that is being challenged and he will know that? I mean, the other word Mark used that I quoted in the introduction is irrational. We're hearing from Biden and now from Angela Merkel that we really should take his threats seriously. Do you think we should? Given, I suppose, the strong man is being challenged, does that lead to a need to sort of prove that in other ways?
I think, I mean, I don't want to get into the kind of game of predicting whether or not Vladimir Putin is going to use a nuclear weapon. But I think we should take his threats seriously. He's now in a position where the conventional ground war in Ukraine is not going well, and there isn't an immediate prospect of that changing. The mobilization is very chaotic. In any case, it would take many months to take effect. These men need training, et cetera, et cetera. And at the moment, Ukrainian forces are on a roll. They're taking territory that the Russians have captured. They're retaking it in the northeast and in the south. So failing a conventional military victory, or something that he can paint as a conventional military victory, he has two other options. One is to concede defeat, and I don't think that he can do that because that would effectively mean the end of his presidency. And the other is to escalate. And, he has been quite clear about what he means when he talks about escalating, because he's in recent days been talking about using nuclear weapons. Now, there are all sorts of ways in which he might use a nuclear weapon. The absolute kind of nightmare scenario is some kind of intercontinental ballistic missile headed towards London or New York. I don't think that's going to happen. I think that we're very, very long way off, and US intelligence, for the moment, are still saying they have not seen any movements of warheads of that kind. So I don't think we're talking about that. But the options are what is known as a tactical nuclear weapon, which is basically a small nuclear bomb used on the battlefield in order to stop an advance in its tracks. But obviously there would be huge repercussions to that, not least the radiation that would likely also blow back on his own soldiers. The third option is some kind of North Korean scenario, whereby it's a sort of test, somewhere up in the Arctic, something like that. As I say, I don't want to get into the business of predicting whether these things are going to happen, but at the moment, Putin doesn't seem to have too many options.
Can I just ask you lastly about the mood? We've talked sort of about the mood amongst these people who gather around him, but the mood in Russia, there is a sense that these images of two things really, I suppose, at the moment, images of retreat and disarray from the troops, and also this mobilization. What kind of sense do we have of how that's going down amongst the Russian people?
Very badly, I think, in short. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people have fled the country since he announced this partial mobilization. Presumably, many millions more are dreading it, deeply opposed to it, but can't get out. I say many millions, maybe that's an exaggeration, but we could probably assume that many hundreds of thousands for sure are feeling that. And in a sense, by announcing this mobilization, Putin has broken one of his contracts with the Russian people. For a start, when this war started, he said in no uncertain terms, read my lips, there will be no mobilization. So he's broken that promise. But more broadly, Putin's compact with the Russian people has always been, you let us rule, you don't get into politics, the people, he's talking to the people, right? Don't interfere in politics. You let us rule, you let us enrich ourselves, and in return, we give you stability, and you can live your life apolitically and have some kind of a small measure of prosperity and stability. And that has been Putin's bargain with the Russian people. Now he's saying, actually, I want your sons and fathers to go off and fight in Ukraine and get killed in their thousands. And that is a very, very different prospect. So I think that really changes the dynamic inside Russia.
Fascinating to hear your analysis. Thank you so much for joining us on Times Radio. That's
My
former
pleasure.
BBC correspondent and Russia watcher Gabriel Gatehouse. Thank you very much indeed.